Our final speaker before our intellectual free-for-all up here is Robert S. McIntyre, who runs Citizens for Tax Justice, which is a coalition of labor, public interest, and citizens groups that fights for tax reform and tax fairness at the federal, state, and local level. It is a very influential group in Washington, and the Washington Monthly recently ranked it at the top of its list as one of the nation's best public interest groups. Bob McIntyre has written extensively on taxes in any number of publications, but probably most effectively in the New Republic. Bob?
Thank you, Fred. It's always good to be here with my friends on this side of the panel, and an honor to be here with some people I don't as often get to see. People I think have some significant and true notoriety in this country for having helped pull off what was probably the biggest financial heist of all time, the 1981 tax bill. And in speaking today, I want to make a distinction between the 81 tax bill and the 86 Tax Reform Act, because they're very different things, and they shouldn't be thought of as part of the same piece of cloth. If you look back at the events that led up to the 81 Tax Act, you'll remember that people were actually saying that a massive tax cut for very wealthy people, along with what was close to repeal of the corporate income tax, would actually make money for the federal treasury. I'm told, and I've read, that one of the panelists here proved this point on a napkin once. And we all remember President Reagan's famous witticism that he was going to pay for the defense buildup with the revenues generated by the tax cuts. Some of the most egregious predictions along those lines came from areas you wouldn't quite expect it, from the business community. The idea of the huge corporate tax cut, which was the heart of the 81 tax bill that President Reagan was proposing, was so attractive to the corporate lobbying community that the Business Roundtable of all groups sent a lobbyist down to the Ways and Means Committee to say that the corporate executives had thought it over and, I quote, believe that the President's plan will trigger increased revenues, although they did put a caveat there that it might take more than 1 year. We also had people saying at the time that these tax cuts, despite all the evidence to the contrary, were going to be across the board, that they're going to be fair to all income groups. That was the standard line of the day. You even had people, and I include David Stockman and Richard Ruhn, saying that adopting a whole set of new tax loopholes, which was the heart of the 81 Act, as I said, along with rate reductions, would actually curb tax shelters. In fact, Richard said it might eliminate abusive tax shelters. That was in his testimony. We had people like from the National Machine Tools Association saying it would foster international competitiveness. In fact, the Chemical Manufacturers Association said it was virtually certain to have a positive effect on U.S. trade. And of course, it was also said at the time that passage of the 81 Tax Act would instantaneously lead to an economic boom. The retroactive business tax cuts designed to encourage business investments that had already been made, and the expectation of lower marginal rates were going to lead to an instantaneous boom. Richard ran it through the Chamber of Commerce computer model and said that there would be a rapid improvement in the economy, a drop in unemployment and inflation, a rise in productivity, real GNP, and workers' pay all the way through the end of the forecast period, which was 1983, immediately. So let's not talk about a delayed cut, Mr. Laffer. This was the prediction at the time by the proponents. Now, it's hard to believe anybody really thought these things when you think about it. Stockman, of course, has admitted that it was just a Trojan horse for trickle-down economics. But some people clearly did believe it. Indeed, it wouldn't be surprising today, it isn't surprising today, to hear people saying that the supply-side tax shift program actually worked. That it worked because it had to work. The logic of it is it had to work. And so does ideology blind people to the facts. So let's look what happened. Well, the deficit was not reduced. It skyrocketed. As Rudy has pointed out, the national debt tripled. Savings and investment didn't pick up. And the economy certainly didn't turn instantaneously upward. Instead, as the Fed cracked down in response to the expected supply-side deficits, we had the worst recession since the 1930s. And clearest of all, despite the talk of across-the-board tax changes, the rich saw their taxes slashed. Middle and low-income people saw their taxes go up with inflation and higher payroll taxes, while incomes for average people stagnated. Now, all of this All of these pernicious effects were predicted by many of us before the bill was passed. Look what else happened. Despite the rate cuts, and certainly because of all these so-called incentives that were adopted in the 81 Tax Act, productive business investment kept being crowded out by a huge surge in wasteful tax shelters, not to mention by increased federal borrowing. Now look, it's not hard to understand that with the government borrowing huge sums of money to subsidize unproductive, uneconomic private investments, that productive investment is bound to suffer, and it did. Reported tax shelter losses reached $150 billion by 1986. Meanwhile, real business investment grew at only 2.1% a year from 81 to 86, and investment in industrial plant and equipment actually fell. We went from a trade surplus to a huge trade deficit. Savings by individuals fell to record lows. Finally, the negative effects of the 81 Act became so clear that even President Reagan had second thoughts. So the Reagan administration put forward what became the 86 Tax Reform Act, in which they curbed shelters, they closed down loopholes, and they ended up having some positive economic effects. Business investment picked up finally after 1986. We saw more investment in plant and equipment after 86. We saw a start towards a return towards tax fairness. But where we stand now, unfortunately, is that we're still paying for the 81 changes. We still have a national debt we need to deal with. We still have an unfair tax system. What our goal should be for the future is not to redo something like 1981, but instead to continue in the spirit of 1986, to try to restore fairness and economic common sense to our tax code, not take a riverboat gamble with a stacked deck.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Fred. A couple of points. I'm glad to see that Richard wants to disavow himself of his predictions in 1981, but he did make them and did predict instantaneous results from the Reagan tax cut, not results after 1983.
Tax cuts were put in, Bob. They were delayed, as you might remember, in 1981. They were not put in until as part of
we have a factual dispute, ladies and gentlemen. I recommend you read the Ways and Means record, which I did yesterday. I recommend that you probably stay away from it, though. People have been convoluting the Social Security trust fund rating of the 1980s with the rest of the budget here for a while, and I thought it would be worthwhile to take a look at the budget without Social Security, because I think Reagan succeeded admirably or disadmirably, depending on your point of view, at cutting the areas of spending that he wanted to cut. If you leave out the Social Security system, which is paid for and is surplus, what you find is that the Reagan administration and the Bush administration are spending far more on defense, interest, and the savings and loan bailout, which was to a large degree a product of their crack regulators. Look at the whole rest of the government, and it's down in inflation-adjusted dollars by $140 billion in 1990. They cut roads, they cut education, they cut the criminal justice system, they cut welfare, and everything else in the government by 20 to 40% as a share of the GNP. The only things that are up are defense, which they wanted to be up, and interest, which is a result of their deficit policies. So don't think that they just gave middle-class and low-income people higher taxes. They also gave them lower services, and they did a heck of a job at it.
Art?